David, how are you?
Hey, Keith, good to see you.
Oh no, the pleasure is mine. The pleasure is mine. How are things on your side of the world?
Well, you know, um, I'm uh, I'm 69 years old, and these are the strangest times I have ever lived in.
I tell me about it. I'm just a couple of years behind you, and I never thought I'd see myself hiding under my bed from and not going out, not going to restaurants. I mean, I live for drinking wine in public places,
Yeah,
and I'm drinking at home. And, and my wife is counting how many bottles I'm drinking. Yeah.
the two the two things that happen is, we're all reaching deep into our cellars at home, and you know, a bottle or two a day, depending on how many people in the household, and then every time we turn around, we run the dishwasher.
Exactly. The dishwasher, and it's incredible. It's been different. It's been different, and the sense of you're living in another world. There is there's like a certain sense of a lack of reality about it all. And you're waiting for that quote normalcy, but who knows when that is and what that'll be. Yeah.
It's going to be a while.
Yeah, yeah. So thank you. This is going to be an exciting. You're one of the smartest guys in winemaking, and
Uh,
the opportunity to sit with you on a Friday afternoon to talk about the things that you have done, the wines that you've created, the science that you have made is my weekend is made. Just a little bit, and I won't ask you to tell about yourself because a large part of this is telling about yourself. So it'll come out as a part of the process. But I first met you about 10 years or so ago. I was doing a certified class here in town, and you came in. Andrew McNamara was the guy doing the class at that time, and you spent 2-3 hours with us. It was the most fascinating lecture I had listened to. I was sold. I had a small cellar at the time. My focus was on American wines. Then we had dinner that night at the Ravenous Pig, and I was at that dinner also. And I became a massive collector of your wines after that.
oh, well, great. Thank you,
Yeah,
Keith.
yeah. But over time, I drifted more towards French and Italian wines. But then we connected again a few months ago at Capitol Grill. They had that tasting,
That's
and
right.
and your Chardonnays just rose up and smacked me again. It reminded me of why I love them, especially the Rochioli Vineyard Chardonnay. It was absolutely phenomenal. So that's my spiel of why I know and love you. Tell us a little bit about you, your history, and I don't know if you know. Do you know Aaron Potts, right? I mean,
Know who?
Aaron Potts. He has a similar. He's a
Oh,
winemaker there in town,
yeah,
and he has
yeah.
a similar. He's a similar history to you in terms of both the French and the UC Davis kind of stuff. But tell us about you.
Aaron's a great guy, and
Yeah.
I spent, I spent 3 months twice, 10 years apart, working in Pomerol. But Aaron spent a year or more over there, so his French is much better than mine. Uh, so, well, I had the undergraduate degree in literature because all I wanted from UC Santa Cruz, all I wanted was to be uh, somewhat well read, at least in some field, American lit. And then I was a waiter for a year in a Sicilian restaurant in Los Altos, and a lot of weekends I'd end up in San Francisco eating at an Italian restaurant in North Beach, the old family style, Gold Spike, things like that. And that's when I really fell in love with wine. And and then I ended up deciding that, well, why not make it? It makes people. It was really sort of altruistic. It was, it makes people happy. I grew up in a household. Both my parents passed away, so I can say this. But I grew up in a household as an only child with two parents, and dinner was at 6 o'clock, and sometimes it would just last 20 minutes with no conversation.
Well,
And then when I discovered wine during my college days, and found that wine could bring people together over a meal that could last for 2 or 3 hours with all kinds of conversation. I mean, I was by virtue of the house I was staying in, I was exposed to University of California. This is in El Cerrito Hills, University of California professors, National Geographic photographers, professors of entomology from Tokyo. And I just thought that wine in some small way could make the world a better place. Yeah. And so it took 4.5 years to go from Chem 1A through the Master of Science in Enology at UC Davis. But, you know, I wasn't doing anything else. And thank God I did, because if I hadn't decided to make wine, I don't know how I would have ended up. I'd probably been a waiter for the rest of my life. And then I worked in France. I worked with Mouex. You know, I still remember I wrote in my crappy French 2, which I had my teacher correct. I wrote a letter. I got names from Maynard Amarine and Ralph Kunke. And I wrote 14 people. I still remember one of them was Madeleine Cassang from Pichon Lalonde. And I got 7 responses, 6 no's and 1 yes. And the 1 yes was from Christian Mouex. So that was 1979. Now, some people say that they work at Chateau Petrus. Let me tell you, nobody works at Chateau Petrus. You know, you work at the time they owned or managed perhaps 28 chateaux, principally in Pomerol, but also Saint-Emilion and Fronsac. You know, that time, fresh out of school, I did pump overs and shoveled out tanks. But there I was exposed to sort of the basics of Bordelais production. You know, light sprinkle pump overs twice a day, more or less 3 weeks on the skins, and then you shovel out. So that was my introduction really to French winemaking, and it stuck. Then I worked in Australia at a factory, Lindemann's Caradoc Winery, just for the experience, because I knew I wanted to go that way, but I wanted to experience it. And then fortunately, my first full-time job was right here in Healdsburg, where we are now, as assistant winemaker to Zelma Long at Simi Winery. She was fresh from Mondavi. And, you know, at the time, 78, 79, you know, a bunch of us were at Davis at the same time. John Koensgaard, Kathy Corson, yep. Dan Lee, David Graves, Dick Ward, you know, Randall Graham, Lee Hudson, and anybody who wanted a winemaking job. All my colleagues from school got full charge winemaking jobs right out of the gate, because that was, the industry was growing so rapidly that, you know, and I knew I didn't want that, because I knew I didn't know how to make wine. I wanted to learn from somebody who I thought did, and so it was a perfect opportunity. Zelma and I did some really good work together for almost 5 years, and then Mary Edwards left Matanzas Creek, and I was asked to replace her, so I did that for 5 years, and sort of changed the style a little, and got the winery built and grew the volume, and then Christian Mouex asked me to back to France in '89, so 10 years later. He had been
following your progress all along, or
yeah.
Okay.
He'd kept in touch and visited me at Simi, and I think at Matanzas, and my now wife of 30 years and then fiance Carla and co-owner of Ramey Wine Cellars went with me. We were married over there. Christian and his first wife Marie-Laure hosted our wedding, and wedding dinner and et cetera. And so then I came back and I took a job for Fred Firth at Chalk Hill. So for 6 years, I helped kind of again change the style and quality of the wine a little bit. Did a lot of travel, much to Carla's regret, because our kids Claire and Alan, who've now.
But by the way, that was my entry point into California Chardonnay. That Chalk Hill.
Chalk Hill.
Yeah.
That was 50,000 cases of native yeast fermented Chardonnay, when nobody really was using native yeast at the time. So that was in the first half of the 90s.
Yeah.
And then Christian asked me to come over and manage Dominus, and so I was really in charge of getting the building, the Dominus building built. But that was also the opportunity to start our own brand. and because I said, Christian, you don't make any white wine. So he said, you want to make a little Chardonnay? That's fine. So I knew Larry Hyde from Matanzas Creek. I bought his Semillon to go into the Matanzas Sauvignon Blanc. And I said, Larry, you got some grapes for me? And he said, yeah. And so that was the beginning of Ramey Wine Cellars. So after a couple of years, I left Christian and Dominus and went to help Leslie Rudd turn the Gerard Winery into Rudd Estate. So that was from like 98 through 01. And then we've been independent since 01. And we've been able to grow the winery. The kids have joined without partners or investors. So, and that's not that common, I don't think.
Right. Now, most of your wine, most of your grapes are sourced from vineyards. If you can talk a little bit about your strategy in terms of the kind of fruit you acquire, how your relationship with the properties that you acquire those fruit from, and also if you look at Kathy Carson, for example, her strategy, she has her own vineyard and stuff like that. So talk a little bit about what goes into the thought process in doing one versus the other.
Well, we did 7 years ago buy our ranch, Westside Farms, 75 acres on Westside Road. It's a mile south of Ropioli, across the street from William Sellium. There's 42 acres of grapevine. But so we both grow grapes and buy grapes. And there's an advantage to both. Let's take, for example, our blocks at Hyde Vineyard, our blocks of Chardonnay at Hyde Vineyard, and our block at Ritchie Vineyard in Russian River. I started with Hyde in 1996 and with Ritchie in 01 or 02, I think. And we have the same block ever since. You can go to Ritchie and see, our rows right there. And then our viticulturist which includes my daughter now, Claire, is in there every 2 weeks. And, there's no difference in quality between whether we grow the grapes or whether we buy from Larry Hyde or Joe Rocchioli or the Martinellis or the Duttons or Kent Ritchie. We just have to pay them a little more money per ton than we could grow the grapes. So, one of the things, there's a sort of a side story in the wine business, and that is money. And there's a lot of people from really outside that made a lot of money outside the wine industry that come in and buy a vineyard and have, estate vineyards and everything. And we're not that way. We started with nothing and have grown out of cash flow. And so when we finally had enough money, we bought a property, and then hopefully we'll buy some more. The arc of vineyard acquisition in the wine business is a little odd. If you start with nothing, you own no land, and then if you're lucky and you make a little money, you buy a vineyard, and then you keep buying vineyards, and eventually maybe you own all your vineyards, like for example Gurgachills does now. My friend Ivo over there. But sometimes then, if the brand sells, for example, when Hugh Blind bought Beaulieu, then they look at all those vineyards on the balance sheet, and it makes the ROI, the return on investment, a little meager. So then the end game, you start with nothing, you end up owning a bunch of vineyards, and then sometimes you end up selling them and leasing them back to get get that asset off the balance sheet. So it's a funny thing.
So tell me a little bit about like Hyde and Ritchie and Rocchioli, and I know especially Hyde and Ritchie. I know, like for example, Aubert makes Chardonnay from there also, or used to make Chardonnay from there. Tell me a little bit about the characteristics of those vineyards. Why Hyde and Ritchie and Rocchioli? What are the characteristics of those vineyards that appeal to you?
Well, you have to be honest. When you're starting out building a brand, you're attracted to name brand vineyards because it lends credibility to your nascent brand, new brand. Over the years, if you're successful and make wines that get good scores, then it becomes a two-way street. Then it turns out that, our brand helps
their brand
build their brand too. So
Yeah.
it is a two-way street.
Yeah.
That said, all of the vineyards we work with are either in Carneros or Chardonnay vineyards, Carneros or Russian River or Sonoma Coast, now Fort Ross Seaview, and they could be as well Petal in the Gap. But what do they all have in common? They're relatively cool, because Chardonnay and now Pinot Noir benefit from growing in cooler conditions. If there's not a lot of great Chardonnay grown in Bakersfield. It's just too hot. It burns the fruit out. So that's the first thing you look for if you're looking at a Chardonnay vineyard. And the next is the soil. You're looking for some good drainage. Typically there's some alluvium, so you have got somewhere in the strata of the soil, you've got some gravel so that you've got some good drainage. In the case of Larry Hyde's vineyard, it's a little more complex, because at about 2 feet or 30 inches, you run into about 30 feet of impenetrable hardpan, clay, and what that does is it limits the growth of the vine. So that's another characteristic. We don't want soils that are too vigorous. We don't want really a lot of growth. So we have smaller vines on generally well-drained soil in cooler climates, and that's where we're going to get some good fruit.
Mm-hmm. But that runs counter to, I've always heard, you want to, force the vines to go as deep as they possibly can. How does that, relate to what you're just saying there? Do you have a hard stop for the vines that you do have?
Yeah, that's a popular story, and there's nothing wrong with it. Those vineyards are great, and some sites the roots can go down 30 feet, and in other sites they don't and they don't need to. Much as I understand it from our viticulturist Daniel Roberts, much of the absorption of water that's required to carry the crop through to maturity is from the surface roots, the feeder roots. This isn't my expertise, but that's what Daniel says, and I believe him. So
well, but yeah, and by the way, we have a question. What chard clones are you working with? But what I've heard is that the vines that grab water from close to the surface, it doesn't have them work hard enough. They're lazy vines. They're not. But I just read this someplace. I'm not viticulturist by any stretch of the imagination.
I want to think of something like that, like a popular fairy tale.
Fake news.
The thing about dry farming is, some sites are suitable for dry farming and others aren't. So for example, we deal with a vineyard in we lease a vineyard in Oakville, Pedregal Vineyard for Cabernet, and it's the bottom of the Vaca range, so it's sloped. It's also about 85% rock, and water just flows right through that. And if you don't irrigate that vineyard, the vines will start to defoliate, turn yellow and defoliate in August. You won't mature your crop.
Right.
Now, if you go over on the valley floor, you've got much deeper soil. The roots can go deeper, find the water. At some of these sites have aquifers running underneath, where you dig a hole in the ground in the winter, and you have standing water at 3 feet. So it's hard to generalize, and every site is independent. And there's a lot of factors, including the rootstock choice that you use, and the spacing, and then the trellising. Is it vertical shoot position? Is it split canopy? How much canopy are you trying to support? A lot of different variables go into that.
Yeah. So again, the question was, what Chardonnay clones are you using?
Yeah. So there's three. I want to say there's three main groups of Chardonnay clones. So you've got the UC Davis developed, which is principally what's now called Clone 4. I believe it was before that called 108. And that was from a Martini selection in Carneros that Harold Olmo found, as I understand the history. And then you have what are now called the Dijon clones, which is a bunch of Entave clones from France, 75, 76, 95, 96, 548 is the Muscati one, I think. And then you have what I refer to as sort of the California heirloom complex, heirloom clones. And these were, of course, all imported from France at some point, back even in the 1800s, or the days with Charles Wetmore, Paul Masson, and of those, my favorite, and many of my colleagues too, I think I would say is the Old Wente. The Old Wente selection is a very small cluster, and it has what we call in English hen and chick, which is a run of big berries and little small berries. The little small berries are shot berries. Shot berries are berries that don't have seeds. The French call that milorandage. So you have inherently a lower yield, which means in a thoughtfully designed vineyard, like say our Wolsey Road vineyard that the Martinellis planted for us, you have much closer spacing, meter by 2 meter spacing, so that you get the yield per acre that you need to make it economic. And I have a tendency to like the Wente selection, but clone is the factor. Climate's first, soil second, and then I would say rootstock spacing, and row orientation and trellising, and then finally the clone.
So clones are interspersed, or do you have clones by block? Are your clones in such a manner that you can actually harvest by clone and ferment by clone?
Like at Westside Farms, our state vineyard, block 1 is the Spring Mountain selection. It's not a clone. Which has a slight muscatty character. Block 2 is the Rued clone, which traditionally, in my experience, has a bit of a floral gardenia kind of smell. And then we have clone 4 in blocks 3, 4, and 5. So and we harvest them separately and evaluate them separately. And I've done that for years. I can make a nice wine out of a Dijon clone, but in general, they were developed back before climate variation. Burgundy used to be a little cooler than it is now. And so early ripening, early maturity was a big factor, a big criteria in developing the Dijon clones. And in California, even in our cooler areas, we have such benign weather that early harvest is not really a decision, not really a factor. So I tend to like the heritage clones. We have another one that Larry Hyde has that Josh Jensen brought in to Calera from someplace in France, and he's had that cleaned up, and it has a much bigger cluster. But I still like it. I don't really look for sort of tropical fruity flavors. I like sort of classic flavors.
Yeah. So how do you determine when to pick your fruit? What are the criteria that you use to harvest?
Well, I may be the only winemaker that would say this, but I've come to the conclusion. Okay, with Cabernet varieties, tannin maturity really matters. You really need to chew the fruit, and when it's not ripe, it puts velvet on your teeth. That's sort of really tannic, puckery. And then when it starts to does not do that, that's when so you need to taste that fruit. You're also sampling and looking at TA, pH, and Brix, sugar. But for Chardonnay, there's no tannin maturity to worry about.
Yeah.
And you could argue that aromatic white varieties, let's say Riesling, Gewürztraminer, Sauvignon Blanc, Viognier, that you have flavor things you're looking for. Like Sauvignon Blanc would be the classic. If you harvested it early, you get greener flavors. If you harvest it ripe, you get more fruity flavors. Yeah. Chardonnay's not like that so much. It's sometimes I say it is the red wine of whites because of barrel fermentation and malolactic. So that's what makes it the complete wine that it is. And to me, it's more about the finished balance of the wine. And to me, that range is typically somewhere between 13.5 and 14.5 alcohol. For some people out there, they may think, oh, 14.5 alcohol, that's really high. There's a lot of misinformation about alcohol levels in the environment. White Burgundy will hit 15% naturally in a ripe vintage. The last couple of Lafleves I analyzed were 1462 and 1475, and traditionally, if faced with a cold, low sugar year, the Burgundians as well as the Bordelais would chaptalize. They'd add some sugar to the ferment. So if they came in at 12.5, they would chaptalize up a whole percent alcohol or more to 13.5, 13.7. So to me, that's a sweet spot, the plus or minus 14% for our Chardonnays, and then it becomes mechanistic. You know, I mean, what's the sugar in the grape? Yeah. You know, we're not gonna spin it to lower the alcohol, pick riper grapes, and then lower the alcohol in the cellar. Yeah. So that's, yeah. So honestly, I don't even taste the Chardonnay. It's right. Where do we want the finished balance of the wine to be?
All right. So we have another question here. It says, in an era of climate constantly evolving, do you see yourself working with non-Burgundian varieties in the future?
Well, you know, we always work with Cabernet, and now
on the white side.
On the white side. Yeah. Yeah. Let me say that if you call it global warming, or, you know, climate change, where we are in the Pacific coast of California is a special place. And maybe only the Chilean coast and part of South Africa are similar, where we have this cold upwelling in the summer of the Pacific Ocean, which cools the air, so that the standard summer day, July or August, during the ripening season, let's say it's going to be 87 degrees, and then it's going to be 57 degrees at night. So there's a 30 degree swing. And the effects of warming, I would say, call it that we've seen is not that it's hotter in the summer, but that we haven't seen so much. It's not as cold in the winter. We haven't seen the frost. It used to get colder than it does now. And so, and then when you couple it with the drought, the 6 years from about 2012 through 2016, something like that, the soil dries out earlier. It didn't get as cold, so bud break is earlier, and that makes harvest earlier too. I think it was in 14 we started Chardonnay on August 5, which is fully a month early, but the season was not shortened. The growing season from bud break to harvest was not shortened. It just was shifted. Wow. You see, so it isn't as simple as saying, oh, it's going to be too hot to grow Chardonnay. Well, not necessarily where we are. So that's kind of my answer there, and probably in my lifetime, it's going to stay that way.
Well, wonderful. So let's turn a little bit to the. So you've harvested those grapes, you've brought them into the cellar. Now, if we look back, prior to World War II, most folks used oak for fermenting, and then with the advent of stainless steel, stainless steel brought some advantages. Things like the anaerobic environment, easy to clean, less contaminants and stuff like that. but a bunch of folks still continue to ferment using oak. So oak obviously had to have some advantages that caused these folks to continue using it as a fermentation vehicle, not on the aging side, on the fermentation side. You ferment with oak. What it is that about fermenting in oak that that provides an advantage as you see it? What's the benefit of fermenting with oak?
So it's three things, Keith, and the principal among them is the small size of the container and the interaction with the yeast lees. The yeast lees are very important, and when you ferment in a large tank, whatever that's made of, you can't really rouse the lees. You can't pick the lees up. It settles thickly to the bottom of the tank. It's like a layer, depending on the size of the tank, it's like a layer of peanut butter. You can't pick it up. Whereas in a barrel, we go in with the baton and do the batonnage and physically pick up the lees. And that's really important. The yeast are still alive. They're not dead. A lot of people hear, oh, after fermentation, the dead yeast fall to the bottom of the barrel. That's not true. They're still alive. They just ran out of the sugar that they used to make alcohol and CO2, and the CO2 kept them in suspension. So we go in and pick them up again. You can't do that in a tank. Now we have some stainless steel drums that are 75 gallons. They're slightly larger than the barrel, but about the same rough size. And we ferment some Sauvignon Blanc for our second brand, our companion brand, Sidebar Cellars, and some Kerner in those. When we made some rosé, we fermented in those, and so you have all the advantage of retaining vibrancy and acidity, but with the yeast contact. Now, moving on with the oak barrel, you still have this little breathability thing. The oak breathes a little bit, and that tension between oxidation and reduction from the yeast is an interesting part of the élevage of the Chardonnay.
So this is during the fermentation, or are you in the aging cycle here? I'm sticking right now. I'm focusing on on the actual fermentation process. So
again, during the fermentation, which is relatively short with native yeast, it's let's say a month, and that redox is not so that oxygen exchange is not so important then, because the fermenting juice is so reduced. It's so that it's inconsequential. It's so saturated with CO2 all the time. It's a very reductive environment. So that oxygen exchange importance is more for later when it's actually wine.
Right. And by the way, as we go through the process, I want you to continue talking about oxygen, because I want to come back and talk about the the premox issue. So as you walk me through the fermentation, malolactic, lees aging, and the actual aging process, I want you to point out the opportunities for oxygen saturation or oxygen, starvation, and where along the way you could run into a problem where you end up where the French did with premox, and why it is that they have premox and you don't. All right, so are there any is there any transferal during I know during the aging process there is transferal of oak properties into the wine. Does that happen during the fermentation process? Is there any wood transfer that goes on at that time?
It starts, it starts during fermentation. It's more pronounced once you have wine, because alcohol is more of a solvent than grape juice. And let me just address too and say that for people who don't like oaky Chardonnays, the answer to that problem, and I consider it a problem too, is not stainless steel Chardonnay, in my opinion. It's less new oak. So the analogy to going to a stainless steel fermentation for Chardonnay would be, because you don't like oaky Chardonnays, would be like if you ate a meal in a restaurant that chef oversalted, and
Yeah.
so you conclude that, well, I'm not going to use salt in my cooking anymore. It's, you know, so
Yeah.
it's the wrong answer to that problem. So, for example, in our Village Chardonnays this year, our Russian River and Fort Ross Seaview, we're only buying 10% new oak. And then in the single vineyards, we're buying 20% new oak, because they're older vines. They can stand it a little more, absorb it a little more. So that's the way you handle over oaked wines. You use less new oak. You don't throw the baby out with the
bathwater.
Now, back to your question, Keith, about premox. I'm confident, but I have some backup for this. I'm confident that some Burgundian winemakers fell in love with low SO2, either ideologically or because it made their wines show better when the critics were reviewing them. And but if you bottle it too low, not only free but total SO2, the bound, because they're in equilibrium. The free and total go back and forth a little bit. There's a loose equilibrium. Those wines, they don't travel well, and they don't age well. So the level of SO2s we're talking about are really minimal. I mean, 100 parts per million total, and then by the time somebody's drinking it, that's 60 parts per million. I mean, you get so much more SO2 in a handful of dried apricots or many other food products and beverages than you do in wine. So that's and my friend, I can say, I think Jean-Charles Boisset, I consulted for him for a little bit when he bought Buena Vista. He engaged the Bordeaux professor, Denis de Bourdieu, to come over and examine this problem. And that was one of his conclusions, is that they weren't using enough SO2 at bottling.
Yeah, that is interesting, because and this is jumping a little bit ahead, because both Jancis Robinson and John Bond had written about this quote new style of production that the French guys are doing, and they were both saying that in the 90s, the type of Chardonnays you're getting out of Burgundy were kind of buttery, rich, toasty, riper, fuller, more enjoyable while young, etc. But they had lost touch with some of that, some of the storage issues, some of the oxygen reduction issues, and when they were forced hit with the premox, they did a lot. They looked at their entire process, their entire production process, and they couldn't identify a single area where the problem was coming from. And so they've started. They did a whole bunch of different things in terms of trying to address the problem. And a bunch of that, they're using a lot more SO2 now. Jancis Robinson talks about this match flint character that you're getting now in the wines that are from there. They're doing a little more reductive stuff. So, for example, Rouleau is is aging in barrel, but then throwing the wine back into tank. So and I refer to that in my thing. I refer to it as an oxo-reductive process. So they're doing some of the aging, trying to get the oxygen transfer during the aging process. But then the last 6-9 months or so, it's in a tank. So that that's a little more of a reductive environment. And again, these are not solutions. These are things that they're throwing out there. But your sense is that they're not using enough SO2 in the process. Spend a little more time on that for me.
Principally at bottling, yeah.
Yeah.
Our Village wines are 12 months on lees in barrel, and then about probably 5 months in tank, where we reuse those barrels in the next vintage, and then the wine is just stored in tank because we're making the next vintage. But then we start working with the wine to clarify it, and we bottle it in January, February. That's kind of what I believe Leflaive is doing mostly, sort of the 12-month. The old way in Burgundy, and I remember Marc Collin, Pierre-Yves' dad, telling me that in the old days, all the wines needed 2 vintages in barrel. So, and still the old, so our single vineyard Chardonnays spend 20 months on lees in barrel. And that's sort of, Côte Plafond still does, Dominique still does that, and Coche de Lis still does that. So I don't think there's anything magical about that, you know, say 7 months in tank after being in barrel. It's more of a practical matter.
Yeah. So we got a comment here. Some folks add a little argon right before putting the cork in the bottle.
Well, you can use the choice of gas. We sparge all our bottles before filling, so that our oxygen pickup at bottling is less than 0.1 parts per million. And the choice of gas, it could be CO2, it could be nitrogen, it could be argon. That's more expensive. Typically, we'll use CO2 or nitrogen depending on what the CO2 level of the wine of the Chardonnay is. And if we want to raise it a little, we'll add CO2. We'll use CO2 gas. If we want to drop it 100 parts per million, we'll use nitrogen gas. So, but we have a specific target CO2 in goal for the bottled wine. What they're talking about, sometimes there is an extra little, you could use a drop of liquid nitrogen, or you could little argon in the after the bottle's full. But for us, we don't do that because the bottle was pre-sparged anyway, completely to less than 1 ppm. So that's the important thing, because then the wine is, that bottling flowing into the bottle, that's the most violent thing that's happened to that wine in its life.
Wow. You know? Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the closure that you're excited about. You're using a lot of that for your bottling purposes. But before that, I just wanted to ask a philosophical question. You spend a lot of time working in Bordeaux, yet the white wine that you chose to specialize in was a Burgundian white. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, you could have done, a Graves type of a white wine, no? I mean,
well, I've pretty much made Sauvignon Blanc for my entire career. Simi, Matanzas Creek, Chalk Hill, not at Dominus, but then at Rudd we picked it up, and then I didn't for 10 years or so. But when we started Sidebar Cellars, one of the varieties we chose to work with is Sauvignon Blanc. So, but Sauvignon Blanc is, I mean, I like it, but it's not as complex. It's not as finely as interesting. It's essentially a more unidimensional wine than Chardonnay. Again, because of the malolactic and because of the barrel fermentation, I think. Although our Sauvignon Blanc is fermented half in those stainless drums and half in old oak barrels, 6-7-year-old barrels. But I just think that, and plus popularity wise, and it's like, somebody asked, was that bank robber Willie Sutton? Or said, why do you rob banks? It's because that's where the money is.
Exactly.
So people will pay more for a bottle of Chardonnay than they will for a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah. Well, and especially Chardonnays of the quality that you bring to the table. Before I get to the closure, I want to, because it's a key part of your reason for being, you did a lot of work in your scholarly career and in your wines on things like native yeasts, bacteria, and sur-lie aging. I want to talk a little bit about that, those topics, and how they are utilized in the wines that you make today.
Yeah, well, the second time I came back from France in '89, I just was really wondering, well, why have the French been all these years, I mean, using native yeast, and we don't in California. So at Chalk Hill in 1990, I did about half of the Chardonnay and all of the Cabernet that way, and then the next year was about 2/3, and then by 92 I was using all native yeast, and it just works. You do have to add.
Isn't there like a big fear in Napa? Every winemaker I talk to, their big fear is a stuck fermentation. This is like the guys walk around with stuff in their back saying, I don't want a stuck fermentation. And there's a sense fear that native yeast, the risk there is a stuck fermentation. Talk to that.
Yeah, no, I know that, but the reason that you have to have 30 parts per million total SO2 in the juice. Now, why? It's not because you're selecting the proper yeast or anything. It's because otherwise the malolactic bacteria can get a start, and that total SO2 is bacteriostatic. It doesn't kill the bacteria. It's not a bactericide. It's a bacteriostat. It just holds them in suspension till the fermentation finishes. If you try to have a ferment with native yeast and you don't add the sulfur to the juice, you can easily get a stuck ferment, and it'll start. And what happens then? And I know this all too well, how I figured these things out.
Hashtag me too.
is you start to smell, and it smells a little like pineapple juice, and then you're about 6 or 7 bricks at this point. So maybe 3/4 through the fermentation. So you got 6 or 7, grams, 60 or 70 grams per liter sugar, and then you analyze the VA, and your VA is all acetic acid. It's not ethyl acetate. The VA is around 0.7, 0.8, 0.9 grams per liter. It's high. And then you look for your malic acid. You run a malic acid determination. Guess what? You got no malic acid. The bacteria came in and they scavenged the nutrients, and that's why you have the stuck ferment. And then as the yeast start to struggle, that acetic acid is a byproduct. So once you know that, and it's just like simple things. And some of my consulting clients, when I'd ask them, we'd start reviewing this, and I'd say, well, did you add sulfur? I said, yeah, we added sulfur. How much did you add? Well, we added X parts per million. Okay, did you check it the next day? No. Well, so we add it at the end of the first the pressing day, and the next day we come in and run all the analyses on the juice, including the total SO2. There's no free in juice; it's all bound to sugar. Yeah. And if we add 50 parts to the white juice, 50 parts per million, we're targeting 40, so I get a little cushion there. And then if we come up at 33, we add it the next day. We just make sure we have the 40, and we never have a stuck ferment. We have no VA issues. We have no Brettanomyces, nothing.
So the lees aging and batonnage. Tell me a little bit about that in your wines.
Yeah. So as I said earlier, the yeast are principally still alive. In fact, I remember Richard Geoffroy from Moet Hennessy telling us at CME in the early 80s that you don't get true autolysis of yeast, the breaking apart of the cell, the autolysis, until after about 18 months, which I love a lot of the French traditions, how they're codified. That's the minimum time in champagne that you need to be entourage is 18 months to be called champagne. Hey, guess what? That's just like, when you stir up the lees in a barrel of white wine, how long does it take for that yeast to settle down to the bottom of the barrel? Well, it takes about a week. And what's tradition in Burgundy for doing the batonnage? Tous les jours, or they say every 8 days, but they mean once a week. So there's there's these traditional techniques that have evolved over centuries, and they might not be able to explain why.
Right. But it has worked for them, and so
yeah,
they know
this
this
works.
works. We don't know
So,
why, but it works.
so so while we've added that little bit of sulfur to the juice to facilitate the fermentation, now we're waiting for the mallow, and we want the mallow to happen later, not right away. We don't want it to push through, and so there's no free SO2 in the wine. So part of the reasons we do the batonnage is to pick the yeast up because they scavenge oxygen and they keep the wine fresh because they're still alive. Okay. The next part of that is the percentage of your barrels that are new, that oak extract is now coming out into the wine. You've got wine, not grape juice, and the yeast, they integrate that in some way. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe manoprotein secretion from the yeast cells, polysaccharides. I'm not expert there. The last thing, and this is really important, is then if you're waiting for the malolactic, when the mallow starts, the bacteria which are eating the malic acid turning into lactic acid and CO2, they have some byproducts, the most notable of which is diacetyl. Now, diacetyl smells like butterscotch candy.
Butter.
Yeah, so if you want to make a buttery Chardonnay, you can do it. But here's the thing, is that the yeast have an enzyme called diacetyl reductase, which, guess what it does? It reduces diacetyl. However, in order for it to do that, they have to be in proximity. The yeast, the diacetyl molecule, okay, the barrel's whatever, 30 inches tall, and the yeast are sitting at the bottom, remember, because they're heavy, and the bacteria are floating, and they're making their own little CO2. The wine is bubbling a little. They're in suspension. So we pick them up to put the diacetyl molecule that the bacteria emitted in proximity to the yeast. And then the yeast can metabolize, can reduce the diacetyl, and then you're just left with a soupçon of complexity, but not unidimensional butterscotch. And that's the importance of lees contact and of batonnage and of integrating the butteriness, so that you get this complexity. Again, one of the things that makes it the red wine of whites without having it be a butter bomb.
Yeah. So now, how long do you normally keep your wine on the lees?
Well, 12 months for the Russian River and the Sonoma coast, and 20 months for the single vineyards, for the Rocchioli, Woolsey Road, Hyde, Ritchie, and Westside Farms.
So now, are you racking these wines at all? I mean, are they getting no? So they're just there. So the oxygen is being. So you said that the yeast is scavenging oxygen also, right? So that's reducing the opportunities for premature oxidation and stuff like that. So what? Before we talk about the cork, tell me what. So the three top Chardonnays that you have, what are the characteristics?
Seven Chardonnays.
But there are three that So we don't have the time to go through the characteristics. So let's pick three of them and talk about because Instagram drops you at exactly 1 hour. So talk about the characteristics of three of them. Pick three. I don't want to tell you to pick your top three because
I have to be honest. While there are subtle differences, they're not huge differences. And this is, I mean, I've proved this many times, but if you take Leflaive, I mean, they make lots of Premier Cru, Pouligny Montrachet, and the house style trumps vineyard. The house style comes later because but if you give the exact same fruit to three different winemakers, you're going to get three really different wines. If you pick three vineyards in three different, I mean, if Pierre-Yves Collin, my old stagiaire, makes a Merceau and a Pouligny and a Chassaigne, the house style is going to be the dominant thing.
Yeah.
So there are differences between them, but they all are our style of Chardonnay,
Yeah.
which I would say is neo-Burgundian,
Yeah.
neoclassical.
Yeah.
We take the very traditional Burgundian techniques and apply them to what I think is California's spectacular fruit. I mean, we have, I remember tasting that Jeremy Sess was leading with us, and his wife, Diana Snowden. I was consulting for Snowden at the time. And he was talking about people sorting their fruit and here in California. He said, "You guys are nuts. You don't need to sort your fruit. You have perfect fruit. You want to come over and see crappy fruit? Come over and look at our stuff sometime."
Yeah.
So we have this essentially perfect fruit at least 9 years out of 10.
Yeah.
And then we take these very traditional old world artisanal techniques and apply them to this fruit.
Yeah.
And what I would say is that our Chardonnays, I like to think, display a nice balance and tension between crisp acidity and smooth richness and roundness.
Beautiful. By the way, someone says that you did the East Coast tour, the Boston Blizzard, Manchester, Providence, New York City, and Philly. Those were the days. Yeah. So sounds like an inside kind of a deal. So who do you who do you look to in Burgundy? In terms of the producers there, who are the ones that you drink?
Well, I can't afford to drink so much anymore.
Come on. You can trade.
The main answers used to be, of course, Lafon and Laflèvre, but also, I mean, back in the day, Colin Delager now my ancien stagiaire, he worked with me at Chalk Hill in 1993. Pierre-Yves Collin Moret, his wines, by the way, are bulletproof. They are not going to be premox because when we bring them in and analyze them, the sulfur it's high.
Yeah.
They're solid.
Yeah.
So and honestly, I have enormous amount of respect for the larger négociants, Drouhin, Latour, Jadot. Everybody wants to, sort of slaver over, small artisanal producers, but, decades of experience and a certain size and a lot of analytical equipment, you learn a lot from that. And particularly I visited with Veronique Drouhin up in Oregon a couple of years ago, and I think particularly the Drouhin family and Veronique's and her brother's experience is, I mean, those are very reliably good wines all the time, and values. I mean, Rouleau's expensive. Lafon's expensive. Laflèvre's expensive.
Yeah. Tell me about it. So at some point in time, these guys are going to drop us, but I also wanted to get a question in. Who are the guys who are trying to make good Chardonnays here in the U.S.?
Oh,
other than you, I mean.
I mean, just I think HDV is doing a very comparable job to us. Yeah. I think Teresa Heredia at Gary Farrell is doing a very good job. But the truth is, I don't know.